Imagine you are standing on a battlefield. The year is 900 AD, the coast of what will one day be called England. Your army is ready, swords drawn, shields raised, men trembling. And then, from the Viking longships, you hear it. Not war cries, not battle chants. Something animal, something that doesn't sound human at all. The men next to you drop their shields and run, because they know what's coming. The berserkers. Warriors so terrifying that the people who faced them believed they were not men at all, but demons wearing human skin. Today we're going to find out what it was really like to be one of them, and I promise you, the truth is far stranger than any legend. Before we go further, let's clear something up. When most people hear Viking Berserker, they picture a giant man with a horned helmet, foaming at the mouth, swinging an axe at anything that moves. That's partially true, but it misses almost everything that made them genuinely terrifying. The word berserker comes from the Old Norse, berserker. Scholars still debate the exact meaning, but the two most accepted translations are bear shirt, as in, a warrior who wore the skin of a bear, or bear shirt, a warrior who fought without armor. Both are accurate, and both tell you something important. Berserkers were not just soldiers, they were an elite, a chosen class of fighter who underwent rituals, training and experiences that separated them entirely from ordinary warriors. In Viking society, and Viking society was already built around violence, the berserker was something else entirely. They were the ones regular Vikings were afraid of. The first written records of berserkers appear in the 9th century, in the Haraldskvathi, a poem about King Harald Fairhair of Norway. The poem describes his guard, warriors who were wolf-coated, who bore bloody shields, and who waded through wounds. They are described as men who fought without armor, killed everything in their path, and could not be stopped by fire or iron. This was not myth, this was their job description. So how did an ordinary person become one of these creatures? The answer starts as Viking society was brutal by any modern standard, but even within that brutality, there were degrees. An ordinary Viking boy grew up learning to farm, to sail, to fight. He learned the sagas, respected the gods, honored his family. A boy who would become a berserker had a different path. Historians believe berserkers were often identified young, boys who showed unusual aggression, physical strength, or what we might today call a complete absence of fear, not courage. That's different. Courage means you feel fear and act anyway. These boys apparently did not feel fear at all. They were taken, or in some accounts they volunteered, to train under existing berserker warriors. This training lasted years, sometimes a decade. What did this training involve? We don't have a complete record, but from the sagas and archaeological evidence, we can piece together something deeply disturbing. First, pain tolerance. Berserker initiates were subjected to extreme physical pain as part of their training. Cold exposure, wounds, deprivation. The goal was not just to build endurance, it was to break the normal human response to pain entirely. Second, isolation. There is strong evidence that berserkers lived apart from regular society, not in the villages with other warriors, but alone, or in small groups, in the wilderness. They were associated with wolves and bears, not as symbols, but almost as companions. Some sagas describe them living among wolf packs. This isolation served a purpose. It made them alien, strange. When they appeared on the battlefield, they came from outside the social world that other men lived in. They were not quite part of humanity anymore. Third, and this is where it gets genuinely disturbing, the ritual. Before battle, berserkers performed ceremonies dedicated to Odin, the god of war, death, and wisdom. Odin himself was described as capable of making his enemies blind, deaf, and paralyzed with fear, and the berserkers were his instruments. The ritual involved chanting, self-inflicted wounds, and almost certainly the consumption of something that triggered the state they were famous for. That state had a name, the berserksgangr, the going berserk, and it was unlike anything else in recorded history. The sagas describe the berserkers' date in remarkable detail, and when you read them you realize this was not just metaphor. These were eyewitness accounts of something people genuinely witnessed, and genuinely could not explain. Here is how the 13th century Ynglinga saga describes it. Odin's men, it says, went without armor, and were mad as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields. They were as strong as bears or wild bulls. They killed men, but neither fire nor iron could harm them. Let's break that down, because every single detail is significant. They went without armor. On a battlefield where arrows, axes, and spears flew constantly, They chose to fight with no protection, not because they forgot it, because they didn't need it, or believed they didn't. The psychological effect on enemies who saw this was immediate and devastating. Because you don't fight a man who has chosen to be naked in your killing field. You run from him. They bit their shields. This detail appears in multiple sources. It's bizarre. Why would a warrior bite his own shield? The answer lies in understanding the neurological state they were in. During extreme adrenaline surges, the jaw clenches involuntarily. Soldiers in modern combat report the same thing. The biting wasn't performance. It was an uncontrollable physical symptom of what was happening in their nervous system. They felt no pain. Multiple accounts describe berserkers continuing to fight after receiving wounds that would drop any other man. An arrow through the shoulder, a sword cut to the arm. They didn't stop. They didn't even seem to notice. This is actually physiologically possible. During extreme adrenaline states, what psychologists now call dissociative fugue, the body's pain response can be almost completely suppressed. The wound is real, the damage is being done, but the brain simply isn't receiving the signal. But here's the question everyone always asks. How? How did they get into this state? There are three theories, and the truth is probably a combination of all three. Theory 1. Mushrooms. Specifically, Amanita muscaria, the famous red and white fly agaric mushroom. It appears constantly in Norse symbolism. It contains compounds that cause intense hallucinations, extreme physical strength, and, critically, a complete dissociation from pain and fear. Viking shamans were known to use it in rituals. The timeline of consumption fits the battle behavior, and in cold Scandinavian winters, it was one of the few psychoactive substances available. Theory 2. Extreme trauma and conditioning. Years of pain exposure, isolation and ritual created warriors whose nervous systems had been permanently altered, not through drugs, but through what we now recognize as trauma responses. The berserksgangr may have been a trained ritualized version of what we today call combat-induced dissociation. The brain learns to disconnect from fear and pain, and through years of practice, the berserker could trigger that state on demand. Theory 3. Pure psychology. The belief itself was the weapon. Berserkers believed they were chosen by Odin. They believed they could not be killed, and that absolute unshakable conviction, with no fear of death, created a fighter unlike anything their enemies had ever seen. Because fear of death is what limits how hard a man fights. Remove that, and you have something that doesn't fight like a human being at all. The truth is probably all three. The mushrooms, working together to create something that the medieval world had no framework to understand. So they called them demons, and left it at that. So what actually happened when berserkers entered a battle? Let's reconstruct it. The ritual began hours before the fighting. Berserkers would gather separately from the main army, in the woods, on the ships, away from other men. They chanted, they beat drums, they consumed whatever substances they used. They worked themselves into a state. By the time they were ready, they were not the same people who had woken up that morning. Viking military strategy was actually sophisticated. Berserkers were not used randomly. They were a shock weapon, deployed at specific moments, usually at the start of battle, to break enemy formations, or at critical moments when the line was about to collapse. They were placed at the front, the most dangerous position, which no ordinary warrior wanted. They were also placed at the sides, where they could hit flanks, and in some accounts they were used as a psychological weapon before battle even began. Brought forward so the enemy could see them, was picking their shields, moving wrong, and feel the fear spread through their lines like a disease. In actual combat, accounts describe them fighting in ways that violated every known principle of Viking battle. Regular warriors fought in shield walls, disciplined formations, where each man protected the man next to him. Berserkers did the opposite. They broke from formation entirely. They ran into the enemy line, alone, swinging wildly, killing anything within reach, sometimes, tragically, their own men in the chaos. The psychological damage this did was incalculable. There is simply nothing more terrifying in pre-modern warfare than a man who does not behave like a man, who does not flinch when you cut him, who does not stop when he should be dead, who keeps coming. The Irish called them warg, wolfmen. The English called them ulfidnar, wolf-coated. The Franks reportedly had a specific word for them that translated roughly as, those who cannot be stopped. But here is what nobody talks about. What happened after the battle? We've talked about what they did, now let's talk about who they were. Because behind every howling warrior in a bear skin was a human being who had made choices, or had choices made for him that led him there. The sagas give us glimpses, and they are not comfortable to read. Berserkers were feared, but also deeply alone. They existed on the margins of Viking society, useful in war, terrifying in peace, welcomed in the king's hall when battles needed winning, avoided everywhere else. Some sagas describe berserkers who desperately wanted to be ordinary, who wanted farms, families, the normal rhythms of Norse life, but couldn't. Because once the conditioning was done, once the training and the rituals had rewired them, there was no going back. The berserksgangr wasn't something they chose anymore. It was something that chose them. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson is one of the most revealing. Egil's grandfather was a berserker. His father was a berserker. And Egil himself showed signs of the condition from childhood. Volatile, violent, impossible to control. At 3 years old, he killed another child. As an adult, Egil was one of the greatest warriors and poets in Viking history. He composed beautiful, devastating poetry about grief and loss. He also killed so many men, in so many uncontrolled rages, that he was outlawed from multiple countries. He was not a monster who happened to write poetry. He was a man, a deeply human man, trapped inside something that had been done to him before he was old enough to choose. The gift and the curse were the same thing. Modern psychologists who study the berserker phenomenon have a term for what the sagas describe: berserker syndrome, a cluster of traits: extreme aggression, dissociative episodes, pain insensitivity, volcanic emotional volatility, that appears in a small percentage of people exposed to extreme early trauma. The Vikings didn't create berserkers. They found them, boys who were already different, already wired differently, and they gave them a role, a purpose, that made them useful, that made them sacred, even while also ensuring they could never fully belong to the world of ordinary men. That perhaps is the darkest part of this entire story, not what they did on the battlefield, but what was done to them before they ever got there. The berserkers are gone, but they left something behind. The word itself survived. Berserk. You use it today. When you say someone went berserk, you're using a 1,000-year-old word for a phenomenon that genuinely terrified the medieval world. Military psychology has studied them, because the dissociative combat state they experienced is not unique to the Norse. It appears in every culture's warrior traditions. Samurai in Japan, berserkers in Scandinavia, the Zulu Impi in Africa, different names, the same phenomenon, and modern neuroscience has confirmed what the Vikings saw with their own eyes. The brain, under extreme enough stress, can do something remarkable. It can turn off the circuits that make normal human behavior possible. Fear, pain, empathy, self-preservation. What's left, stripped of all of that, is something that fights in a way no trained soldier fights. Pure, instinctual, unstoppable. The berserkers were real. The state was real. The terror they caused was real. And somewhere in the dark places of human neurology, the capacity for it is still there, waiting. So, what was it like to be a Viking berserker? It was to be chosen and cursed before you were old enough to understand either. It was to be the most feared thing on any battlefield in the medieval world, and the most isolated person in any room at peace. It was to experience something that modern science is still trying to fully understand, a state where the human brain crossed a threshold that most people will never come close to. It was to serve a god who valued your death as much as your life, and to know that the same people who called you sacred in war would outlaw you in peacetime. The berserkers were not the mindless savages that popular culture made them. They were something far more interesting, far more tragic, and far more human than the legend allows. If you want to go deeper, the next video in this series covers the Spanish Inquisition, and I'll tell you right now, the real methods, the real numbers, and the real reason it happened are nothing like what you learned in school. That video is already up. But before you go, tell me in the comments, would you have run from the berserkers, or stood your ground? I'm genuinely curious, and I read every single comment. This is Dark Chronicles. History isn't what they taught you.